Are you working to produce software where some big bets are being made and there's fear of failure throughout the culture at the organization? Well, stay tuned because today we're going to talk about how failure can be a great thing and how you can actually profit and have more fun on your projects if you embrace a failure and learning mindset. Hi, I'm Jamie Edwards and I help software development teams and software companies to do a better job releasing their software, understanding what their customers want, and having an environment where people can be as creative and innovative as possible. Today we're going to talk about how you can fail faster and more often to get your team's projects aligned with the right direction for what's going to be most valuable and profitable to the business. Now, to start off this whole talk, I want to talk about assumptions a little bit. There's a fundamental assumption that we all make when we work on software development efforts, and that assumption is, are we going to continue the project and is it going to be successful? Now, the way a lot of projects are budgeted and ran today, there's a budgeting process that the product goes through where the business decides, what are we going to build, how much is it going to cost, and how long is it going to take to get done. When we budget a project over an extended period of time, and that extended period of time has to complete before the project's considered done and then handed off to the customer, we're really delaying finding out if our theory about what was valuable about that product is true until we've spent a lot of money. So what this video is going to help you with a little bit is understanding when you go to develop a software product, if you take 6 months to a year to release something and then find out that there's a failure. And when I say failure, what I really mean is it's a learning opportunity. You know, today, again, in these projects where we budget a whole lot of work up front, and then we build all of that work and we don't deliver it until the end, nobody's actually realigned with what the customer thinks of what was built until all that money's been spent. Like I said, there's one big assumption, which is that the project is going to be successful and it's not going to be canceled. But there's also a whole bunch of underlying little assumptions that make up that project that are often not true, and the team doesn't actually find out they're not true until they begin working on the project. And at that point, if typical waterfall types of approaches of estimation, and even some Scrum projects that estimate a large quantity of work and it's all sitting in the backlog, from that point on, we're fixed somewhat in our scope of what the project's going to deliver, and it's actually emotionally challenging to deviate from that. So what I want to talk a little bit about is how we can actually embrace a failure mindset, and what are some of the things, simple things we can do on projects to make sure that we fail quicker so that we can realign the direction the team's going. So first, let's talk about some typical assumptions on software projects that often aren't true, and if we find that they're not true at an inopportune time, it can be looked at as a failure of the team or a failure of the product or a failure of the company, when really it's just an opportunity to learn and to do better. But if we could learn that information early in the project and not learn it at the end, we'd have the motivation and the money and will and resources to actually fix that issue and not have it be a failed assumption or a limitation. So what are some of the assumptions that people make today on software projects that end up preventing them from failing faster? Well, one of the first of these things is assumptions about the skill of the team. You know, I see a lot of teams that are working on a software project where 2/3 or more of the members are new to either major aspects of the technology or the process that's being used to develop software. Perhaps there's a whole new way that the company would like teams to do requirements, whether they do user stories or acceptance testing or, you know, whatever method is used for testing. If there's a new method for testing the product and nobody's ever really done it before, well, we're making an assumption that all the estimates around the testing effort are going to be solid, and probably they're not because it's something new to people. Same with, you know, I talked about requirements? Well, things like DevOps. If we're doing DevOps on a team for the first time and this product is going to need to be released rapidly, multiple times per day out to the cloud or a data center, and major members of our team that are responsible for that work have never worked with that particular technology, or maybe it's a different cloud hosting infrastructure, well, then we're assuming that those people know everything they need to know to make that project successful. And in my experience, this is all I can share with you is my own. Every time I've been asked to do something new, I'm successful with it, but it takes me longer, and there's a lot of things I need to learn and a lot of things I don't know that I don't even know until I begin the work. So one of the fundamental assumptions that a lot of us make on projects that prevent us from failing faster is we assume that everybody on the team has the level of skill that's needed to complete all the things that will be asked of them with no rework necessary. More often than not, each person on a team has more skill in some areas and less in others. And this exercise we go through today of where we have a senior person or an architect estimate a large quantity of work and hand it over to a bunch of people who don't have the same skill level as the architect, it's never worked well. So one of the things I want you to understand as we go into some of the solutions for these assumptions is, what can we do about the fact that our team has varying levels of skill, and how can we learn what their true levels of skill are earlier so that we can make the investments in maybe learning, in mentoring and training that people have to make so that those assumptions are true. The second assumption that we often make on products and software projects is, are the changes that we're releasing in our next release to the customer acceptable from a quality and requirements and testing and meeting the needs that the customer expected us to in the product? Well, we make assumptions every time we build something that it's been tested properly, that it's got the right security checks around it, that it's had the right UX people maybe look at the experience. Whatever all the different aspects of developing that change are, we're assuming that those are all correct, oftentimes right as we're releasing it to the customer. If any of those assumptions are wrong and we haven't tested, let's say, the feature to the level that we thought we should, maybe the QA department or developers who are doing their own testing, however your process is set up, people have done the testing, they've followed the process, but things were overlooked because we're humans, like I talk about on this channel all the time. We're going to make mistakes. Well, if we go into a project constantly with the assumption that everything's being tested properly, but it's not, and we don't find out the true state of the testing until the end of the project, once we've spent, like, let's say $1 million budget, how much money do we have and how much motivation do we have to actually fix issues with testing that late in the game? We don't. And many businesses will simply put it off, and it becomes one form of technical debt, something that's actually going to slow down the ability for the business to produce new features and deliver new value to their customer. So if we make the assumption that features are always of the appropriate level of quality during a long period of work before we deliver it to a customer, we're actually losing out on the chance to fail or learn early in the process. You know what? Your testing's not solid enough. You know what? The way you're doing requirements maybe doesn't make sense. The design that people have come up with doesn't take into consideration a whole bunch of issues with the technology. So one of the fundamental things that you need to consider when you're delivering software is often there are many assumptions that you've made about the completeness of your understanding of the project and the product that are simply not true, and that understanding isn't going to emerge through simply sitting in a room and talking to customers more or writing more documentation. That understanding is going to emerge once you start releasing something to the customer and get feedback on your vision. The third assumption we make, which is closely related to the previous one, is that the customer even values the change that you're putting in front of them. So when we go to deliver a release of software, it often includes one, or unfortunately many, changes. And each of those changes the business has theorized are going to have some positive impact on the customer. Well, every one of those releases is still a theory of value, meaning we may have done all kinds of upfront things like talking to customers and running usability studies and doing a whole bunch of documentation around what the product needs to do. But at the end of the day, it's very common to build something a customer wants, release it to them, and have them not find it as useful as they said it would be. So if we're going to avoid delivering a lot of things that are wasteful to the customer and aren't valuable, we need to actually deliver less to them before we find out that it's not a good idea or a failure or a learning opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some ways we can use technology and process to help the team fail faster, to get feedback and learn more quickly. And I'm also going to talk about how the business can use processes for managing the product and working with the engineering team that'll actually produce failures quicker so that they can be making the right decisions. Before I talk about either of these categories though, I want to talk about the overall practice that really will impact how quickly you're able to fail, and that is doing less at one time. We want to do less at one time because if we find out any of the assumptions that I just talked about in the beginning of the video, that those are wrong, the earlier we can find those out, the better. Well, the way we're going to find those out early is if we start releasing the software much quicker. You know, if you think of what's involved in releasing software, there's the envisioning phase, some form of requirements, there's deciding how it's going to be acceptable or the acceptance testing approach, writing the code, maybe rolling out infrastructure, there could be code reviews, there could be approvals, there could be automated or non-automated deployment. All that stuff has to happen every time we release the software. Well, if we start releasing the software multiple times per day, we're going to do all those things multiple times per day. So why would we do less at one time on software projects, meaning have a team produce one single change and get it out to the customer as soon as it's ready, instead of a large group of people working on multiple changes that all have dependencies in a traditional waterfall type of fashion and rolling that out in some sort of coordinated release? Well, one of the reasons is it minimizes risk. If we do less work before releasing it to the customer, if there's anything that we did wrong, we either release the software with an issue, maybe it wasn't tested properly, maybe the database, something about the performance wasn't right, maybe we didn't do a good job of acceptance criteria. There's a team that's new to doing this and they haven't learned how to do it real well. Maybe some developers wrote some code that doesn't handle an edge case that we all thought on a team that it did. Well, you're going to find that information out the quickest when you get it in front of a customer and you release it. So if we can start releasing stuff to our customers more frequently, we're going to minimize risk because we're going to find out mistakes we're making as a team on our process as early in the product's life cycle as possible, and that's when we're going to have the highest motivation to change it. It's just a normal human thing that if you put off discovering something that needs to improve until you're almost done, your motivation to do it is going to be lower than if you identify it at the beginning. So if we can release software more frequently and find out we've failed to meet some assumption earlier, we're actually psychologically motivated to take action on it quicker and actually make sure it gets done. Doing less at one time before you release features to customers also helps the business realign their priorities. If the software development team is chugging along for a year building something and there won't be a release for customers for that entire year, that's basically time off almost from the business, from them needing to actually re-steer and adjust where the product's going if everybody just marches along and builds what was designed a year ago. When you're actually doing agile software development or lean software development or any of these approaches I'm talking with you about on this channel where you're trying to be more adaptable, you're actually instead going to release something to a customer, let's say daily or once a week, and as soon as you get feedback, that feedback doesn't just go on a list where people look at it at the end of the project. It immediately needs to have action taken on it. You know, if we're in the middle of building, let's say, a order management product of some sort, and the first release we do of the project, we're listing what orders are going to look like, and we're releasing this in a lean fashion, and the product's not done. There's just a little slice that the users can now see and they're starting to evaluate as it's emerging. Well, if there's a problem with that order management screen, why would you have the team continue on other features when that's the most valuable part of your product that has to be right? It makes much more sense to refocus the whole team on addressing whatever feedback was obtained by the user in that last release, no matter what. Because then you're always steering everything you build to be the best copy of what you can put forth for that customer and give you the biggest chance that they're going to have the best experience, and it's going to cause the growth and the brand recognition that you need for a sustainable product. So if you release less often and the business actually takes action on it as soon as they get feedback, that really is a huge opportunity for the business to be able to realign what they need to do in the market as their needs are changing and as the market's evolving, with much less risk than if we do these, big bang, upfront, large budget, large scope estimating efforts. I talked about this a little bit, but another reason why releasing less at one time is extremely valuable to the business is it improves return on investment. If you invest a bunch of money and you have to wait a year until you find out if any of that's valuable, and only then do you start to actually get some return, in other words, there's some profit made or some revenue coming in because of that investment you made, well, that whole year, there's not a dime that the business is making. They're just spending, spending, spending. Well, if you release something every week or every day, if that feature turns out to be valuable to your customer, then you can begin to profit off of it or receive whatever improved sales goals you're going to be able to hit, or satisfaction ratings, or new customer accounts you're able to go after. Obviously, if you can do that in a shorter period of time, that's better than waiting until a longer period of time. I think a lot of businesses, though, they look at Agile and they think, well, I'm going to take everything that I want to do that would normally take a year, and through Agile get it done in 6 months. That's not the point of agility. The point of agility is to actually do really small changes and actually get them out to your customer and have them be done quicker and get feedback and adapt. And the last big benefit to doing short releases, which is really going to help your team fail faster, is it improves the frequency with which people practice. I talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the video. If nobody has to actually do a production release more often than once every 6 months, how good is the team going to be at that? They haven't practiced it very much. If you only test your product once every 2 weeks, how good are you going to be at testing the product? That's not very much practice. So the more often we do releases, that forces everybody who's involved with releasing that product to do their part of that whole puzzle to get it out in front of customers as frequently as the release happens. So if releases are going to start happening once a week and you used to do them every 3 months, do you think people are going to have to get better and faster at approving releases? You bet they are. They're going to have to be able to approve a release within like an hour, look it over, see what the change is, and give it a go or no go. Now, many people think, I can't do that with a release today. It takes me maybe weeks to sit down and look over everything and look at the requirements and do testing. Well, that's how long it takes to do a large change. But we're not talking about large changes. We're talking about little, small, tiny changes that are just to validate some idea or make an incremental improvement to your minimum viable product. That's something that should be able to be approved and released to a customer, even if you've got a group of maybe 3 to 5 people that are involved, at least once a day. So if you begin to release software more frequently and you want to embrace a learning and failure mindset, what this is going to actually cause you to benefit from is everybody's going to get a higher level of mastery around the disciplines that they're related to with developing software. UX folks are going to get better at UX because they're going to get feedback on their decisions quicker. Developers are going to get better at developing because they're going to get feedback on maybe areas where they didn't do well enough in, meeting, let's say, the requirements or something like that. Infrastructure people, if they're a separate role and DevOps isn't fully integrated, they may be learning some things about how they're setting up the infrastructure that aren't quite working right, but they're practicing it now daily or weekly. They're able to make big improvements in it. So these are all just things that releasing more frequently will really help your team with, and they're big benefits to doing these quick releases that have very little changes in them. So next I want to talk though specifically about two different categories of improvements that you can make to the way that you develop and release software that will help your team fail faster. The first category of these improvements are more of sort of technical, process-related changes, and the second category are more for the business or the product side of the house. So the first way that we can fail faster or learn something quicker that tells us we're not going in the right direction or we're not doing the appropriate level of work is to have artifacts available, especially for the engineering team, that give us the current state of the code at any time. What do I mean by this? Well, if we have everybody checking code into one branch at a time, I talked about this in the uncertainty video from a few days ago. One of the things that's going to be happening is people are going to be working on changes that aren't being rolled out to production yet. They're hidden behind a feature flag. I've talked about feature hiding before, but they hopefully have some sort of tests running. And if a team gets together and decides we're going to build some change and here's how we're going to test it and here's what's going to be considered acceptable about it, and then the developers or QA people or whoever performs that role is going to write some automated tests to indicate whether that test is passing or failing, if the team can find out at any time or every time somebody checks in code which tests are passing and failing and which acceptance criteria that the team decided needs to pass before a change is available for the customer in production, if they can find that out all the time, almost immediately, that's going to allow them to know when they're failing to meet acceptance criteria. It's also going to help them know, have we maybe not had adequate test coverage? So this is another technology people will use. This is available for Ruby, .NET, JavaScript, almost all the technologies. There are tools that you can use that every time you kick off your automated tests on a feature, it can look at all your code and figure out, are there large sections of the code that you wrote that aren't being covered by any tests, and kind of help you be a little bit more honest about the level of test coverage that you're doing. But there are many tools that the engineering team can use, things that will tell them, for example, is everybody using the right coding standards? Maybe the team has agreement on what should be capitalized, what shouldn't, how certain functions should be formatted in the code. Now, these are things that are very specific to the development team, but it may be a standard or a practice that the team's decided they'd like to follow. Well, if we can find out as quickly as possible, somebody's not following that standard and have a tool that can catch that, that's really going to help you fail faster and find out that the practices that are supposed to be being followed aren't. So that's one thing I just want you to think about as you're improving your team's ability to do work and make changes is, are you using technology and processes that can give the team artifacts, whether it's, printouts or notifications or build logs or emails or, however you communicate them to people, that can tell the team some aspect of the work that we're doing isn't being done to the level of quality that we all expected as a team, and we need to stop what we're doing and address this issue before we continue. Another way we can fail faster on sort of the technology and process side of improvements here is to actually use cross-functional teams. I talked about the journey to cross-functional teams in another video. You can go back and watch that. But basically, if you have teams that are separate for different disciplines, UX has its own department in the company, and dev is its own group, and ops is its own group, and support is its own group. And when somebody needs UX assets for the project, they have to sort of almost like subcontract as a service from the UX team. Hey, we need you to make some changes, and now they have to wait. Well, that's going to cause releases to take longer. And if we want releases to happen quickly and we want to fail faster, we need to have all the people that represent the different disciplines that are needed to deliver software need to be part of a team that's all responsible for that product, so that any change that needs to be made that needs input from a discipline, there's no lag time to have to go service that from a different department. Instead, you have that capability immediately on the team. And another thing we can do to fail faster or learn that we're not doing maybe everything we need to on a project and improve is to simply hold retrospectives. What is a retrospective? Well, it's essentially a meeting where people get together and they talk about in the last release what went well and what didn't. And this started kind of to be more common in the Agile circle in Scrum, the sprint retrospective. So if you're doing sprints, your team's still planning and delivering work every 2 weeks or once a month or however long your cycles are. One of the things that the Scrum community would like you to do, and I think it's a good practice, is every time you complete a sprint and you release that change, the team gets together and holds a sprint retrospective. And the purpose of the retrospective is to get everybody together and talk honestly about what went well and what didn't go well. And it's not a shaming meeting. It's not a meeting to come out of to say, hey, here's the 10 cool things we came up with that we want to improve. If you go through the retrospective and nobody has anything to improve, that would surprise me. But at the same time, then just leave it as is and enjoy that sprint. I really dislike when people tend to use the retrospective as some sort of measuring stick that they can show to management. Look at all the things that we're improving. Make it actionable and real. If there aren't things to improve, there aren't things to improve, but don't stop holding the meeting. But even if you're doing Kanban, I've seen this in other articles. I talked about this too in my Scrum versus Kanban video. I think if you're doing Kanban and you don't have the team regularly getting together for planning and kickoff and wrap up meetings like we do in Scrum, it's still good to hold retrospectives periodically, because this really gives a chance for people to find out, the way that we're doing requirements isn't working. It's failing somehow and we need to improve. Or the way that we're testing database backups, it's failing somehow. We need to learn from this and we need to improve. If we don't have a retrospective on a Kanban team, it's really completely up to people to keep track of things that could be improving and selling them independently to the rest of the business to make continued investments in. Another technical way to fail faster is to do canary or ring releasing. So having a production environment where Facebook does this all the time. You can choose, okay, I may have, let's say, 100,000 customers. I want to release a new version of my change that I'm theorizing is going to be valuable to the customer, but I don't want to roll it out to all 100,000 customers. I only want to roll it out to 1,000 customers. And having a system in place in the way that you release your software, that you can release a change to a ring or a small subset, or the other term is canary releasing, kind of like you send a canary into the coal mine, and if it dies, that there's gas that's dangerous for people to work there. I mean, it's a kind of a crude example, but that's where that concept came from. This is what you're doing with the software. You're putting a change out there to find out, is there an issue with the software, or maybe the customer really doesn't like it, that I can identify just by exposing it to a limited audience instead of everybody, and then make a go, no-go decision. So that's something that the team can also do to help fail faster, is ring releasing or canary releasing. On the business side, there's a number of other things you can do also to help the team release more quickly and thus fail faster by learning what you need to do differently quicker. The first of these, and I've talked about this in the A-Being software development video, you can go back and watch that, is have a measurable pass-fail for each change. So if the business is theorizing that by making a change, profits are going to go up by a certain amount, or support incidents are going to go down by a certain amount. Before you even go and build that, you need to decide as a business, how are we going to measure that this impact actually was made, and what number is going to tell us that it wasn't worth the investment, and what number is going to tell us that it was worth the investment. Why is this so important? Well, when we release that change, it's probably just the beginning or part of a whole bunch of changes that are all related to that same feature or thing that the customer needs. And if we have a measurable way of telling us whether this is actually a good idea or a bad idea when we release that little change to them, if we find out that it's a bad idea and we actually don't want to redesign it, we think that the core theory of value around that feature is not good for our customer, then we can stop investing in it immediately. Don't build any more of the other features in our vision that are related to that one core feature if we've determined that it's not a good idea. That's going to save the company a lot of money by not having to wait until all the bells and whistles around a feature were built and then delivering it to the customer and finding out, oh, we don't want this, and all that money was wasted. Another way to fail faster is to minimize parallel tracks of work. We do this by focusing on cost of delay. So a lot of projects, software projects or software product efforts, there may be 100 ideas that the founder or the product manager or the subject matter experts or the team has for what's going to be valuable for the customer. And if we have a team of, let's say, 5 people, or maybe we've got 3 teams of 6 people, that's quite a few people to make changes to a product. So the thought is, well, the business needs to make sure everybody's being as busy as possible. So what we tend to do is take a whole bunch of features off the backlog that are on top that aren't, dependencies of each other. They're not, one needs to be complete before the other can start. And we hand each of those off to these teams and have them work on them in parallel. And what ends up happening, though, often in my experience, is if those teams take 2 weeks to a month to 6 months to release their changes, and one gets done early and makes their changes and releases them to the customer, and the other 2 teams are still working on it, well, the business will then have the team that finished early just take what's next off the backlog and the next off the backlog, and they're basically constantly building more and more and more deep into their vision. But there's 2 teams that are still building something that hasn't went out to the customer yet, and there's a good chance that when they release it to the customer, if they followed the prior tip that I just gave you, which is to have a measurable pass-fail, well, if either of those teams have a failure, which there's a good chance they will, they'll find, what we theorized in the market was going to be valuable about this change, it's not hitting the mark that we set out for it. Well, now you've got a team that could actually be working with those 2 teams that now need to readjust what they're working on and working together as a group and bringing all the smartest minds together to make the best decisions to move forward on the project. But instead, when we keep people kind of in these lanes of productivity where they're constantly cranking out features, the tendency for the business is not to really be able to put the brakes on and really take feedback they're getting in the market seriously enough and disrupt potentially all the teams to make the right decisions. Instead, the psychological tendency is to just continue doing work as usual and keep people as busy as possible. And if you go back and watch my first and second videos of this channel, I'll talk about why that is such a bad approach for software development, because it's really ignoring the fact that all the studies show, and all my experience has been, that every time we build a software product, many of the things that we deliver are not valuable to our customer. And so we need to fundamentally change the way that we're releasing software so that we do less of that and waste less money. As I said before, the way we do this, though, is we do less things at one time, and we always focus on the thing with the highest cost of delay. So if there's 100 ideas a team's going to work on, and maybe only 2 of those have the potential of generating a couple $1 million of revenue for the business, instead of having the team work on everything in that list of 100 items, everybody should just be working on the 2 items that are going to potentially make the business $1 million. And only when that's been delivered and it starts delivering on the $1 million should the rest of the company start to build anything else. Instead, I see people too often try to budget and design a huge quantity of work. And even if they're using Scrum and Agile to actually break up the pace at which they're doing the work, they're not changing what they're going to actually deliver to the market very frequently. And so they're really missing out on the opportunity to shift and adapt and make dramatic changes to the product to actually deliver those amazing products that truly delight customers and really make a product profitable and attractive in the market. Another thing the business can do to help teams fail faster is to put less detail in the backlog. What do I mean by this? Well, when doing budgeting, it's common for a Scrum product owner to actually go through, let's say, 6 months to a year's worth of work and write up all the acceptance criteria and all the user stories and put in all the detail that would normally come out only when the team starts to work on something to get more acceptance criteria. If the business invests in actually figuring out the true cost of effort in 100 ideas, they've already made a further investment just in coming up with how much that 100 ideas is going to take to build. And so as they begin releasing the 100 ideas, If they find out a third of the way through it that a whole bunch of the ideas that they had slated for their customer weren't good ideas, that can be a psychological blow to the ego because it's looked at like they're failing when they didn't really fail. They actually just learned that some of their ideas weren't good. Well, this is why I prefer to see teams, whether they're doing Kanban or Scrum, to do planning in a grooming fashion, where if you've got a list of 100 ideas, we only really need to figure out detail around the top maybe 2 to 5 ideas, or whatever those set of changes are that the team's actually going to start working on first. Everything else, we're not really ready for it yet. It's not worth investing in, and we're not freeing up the team psychologically to move it into a different direction to deliver the right thing if we've already invested so much in estimating and figuring out the detail behind a lot of things that we may not even build. And the last thing that the business can do to really help fail faster is to budget monthly. I talked about this in my last video and many of the other videos on this channel. If the team is going to have the flexibility to get feedback from the customer or from the business every single time they do a release, and they may learn that something that the customer wants is different, if that's going to be looked at as a learning opportunity and not a failure of the business to just predict what the customer wants, well, then there needs to be money available to respond to that change. And if the way budgeting is done is investments are done on scope that the business agrees in up front, then there's not going to be money left over. And when there's a change in scope, it's going to cause rebudgeting to need to be done. Rebudgeting is an extremely painful process because it makes everybody at the company anxious. They feel like they didn't do a good enough job of figuring out what the customer wanted. They don't want to spend any more money. They already probably had to push hard for the money they got already. So the way to fix all that is to simply say, hey, how much money is the business willing to spend month to month to continue to invest in delivering a quality product, and let go of the scope and let the team and the business and the company steer what's done with that monthly budget month to month to best meet the needs of the market and the customer as you're releasing to them. So please give me a thumbs up below, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.